Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a new doctrine on Friday that names NATO as the country's top military threat. In the doctrine, Putin said that NATO forces near Russia's border could be used for political and military pressure, and that has led some to contemplate if Putin is setting the stage for further military escalation in his region, or perhaps even World War III. Fox News strategic analyst Ralph Peters is here to discuss this and other international affairs and strategies. Good to see you, Ralph.
Hey, great to see you, Doug.
What do you make of this new doctrine announced on Friday?
Well, it's certainly serious, but it is two-thirds for domestic consumption. If you follow the Russian media, which has a very different worldview than our media does, well, a little close to MSNBC, but other than that, it's really a situation where Putin has created a fantasy world for the Russians, and the Russian media play along. Even though they've got some smart journalists, they're very cynical. They do what they're told to do. And so if you are a prisoner of the Russian media, the average Russian citizen, you're being bombarded with the idea that America's out to destroy Russia. Europe is America's lackey trying to destroy Russia. They're attacking the Bulgarians for not standing beside their Orthodox brothers. It's a cult of victimhood worthy of Al Sharpton, but Al Sharpton with nukes.
That raises my next question right now. In this doctrine, he suggested, Putin did, a new use for Russian nukes, that they would not only be used for retaliation against a NATO nuclear attack, but also against a conventional attack that caused grievous harm to Russia. What do you make of that?
Well, there are two sides of that. One, he's a bully, and he says provocative things. He's a smarter version of Kim Jong-un. But the other part of it is that despite all the ballyhoo about how great the Russian military is, they do maintenance with sledgehammers. It's a big but clumsy force. The ragbag troops you saw in eastern Ukraine, for instance, those are Russian elite troops. Those are their equivalent of U.S. Special Forces or Army Rangers. And they're ragbags. Now, you only have to be better than the enemy. And the Russians are much bigger and better than the Ukrainians, because the previous Ukrainian president was Putin's tool and he essentially disarmed unilaterally. But Putin knows that his military, in a conventional conflict, could not begin to stand up to the United States and its allies. So he's saying, hey, don't mess with us, we might use nukes. But again, there's a little touch of madness, but there's a great deal of savvy maneuvering. I mean, Putin knows his people. He's an old KGB guy. He's very, very good at assessing his interlocutors. He sized up one American president after another, one Secretary of State after another, and the only thing that blindsided him is he's a poor economist. But I tell people, when I hear people on the American left celebrating and saying, oh, well, Putin, we stopped Putin now. Oh, no, Obama's sanctions worked. No. The collapse in oil prices, helped by the sanctions, put the brakes on Putin, but did not break Putin. It would take 2 to 3 years of oil prices in the 40s or 50s, say mid-50s for Texas, West Texas Intermediate, to really derail Putin's plans. And he's got big plans for the Russian military because he does want to build a first-rate military, but in the immortal words of that great American Marxist Cyndi Lauper, money changes everything.
Well, it's interesting you talk about oil prices, certainly compounding the problems of the sanctions, but he has a new fan in the United States, apparently, that he speaks highly of.
Well, yeah, he's joined Governor Cuomo's fan club. It's funny, the Russian papers are just such a hoot. Stephen Colbert was never this funny, except they're trying to be serious. And they've discovered Governor Cuomo as a new hero because he banned fracking. The Russians have a horror of fracking because it's helped drive down oil prices. It's a threat to them. So they've suddenly decided, and Russia's environment is incredibly polluted, they've suddenly discovered that fracking is a threat to the environment, and Governor Cuomo is a visionary worthy of going down in the history books.
It's a threat to high oil prices, too. Real quickly before you go, the end of combat operations at the end of this year in Afghanistan. At the time, the president told troops in Hawaii just this week that it will no longer be a source of terrorist attacks. How does he know that?
Well, he doesn't. Of course he doesn't. You know, we heard from the president that Al-Qaeda was finished. Look, he may have declared the war in Afghanistan over. It ain't over, just as Iraq wasn't over. The president, too, lives in a fantasy world of his own. The difference is that Putin uses fantasy and plays upon the Russian people. President Obama seems to believe some of his own fantasies.
We'll leave it with that. Ralph Peters, always appreciate your
Happy
insight.
New Year, Doug.
You too.